Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say right out the bat that I am on this wooden thing because I am so short, and I can assure you I will at some point fall off of it. So just try not to laugh too hard. But a funny story about having an 8-month-old. So I was pregnant throughout the last legislative session, and it was a running joke around the Capitol for those of you who may cover Louisiana politics that I would go into labor at some point, and they were like, only do this, try to control it, only do this if it somehow can help us with a bill. And I, was like, I don't want to go into labor in the middle of anything. But sure enough, I ended up having a daughter. 15 minutes after Sine Die, my water broke, and I had her 2 o'clock the next morning. So she has perfect timing, and I can assure you she will be a political guru in her future. But as Jim had said, my name is Morgan Lamandre. I'm the president and CEO of STAR, and that's a relatively new title for me. As of January 1st, I have had that title. Previously, I was our legal director as well as our policy director, and as legal director, I provided direct legal representation to sexual assault survivors, and as policy director, I went before the legislature, testified, and supported various bills. And in this role, it's quite a challenge because I'm still having to deal with some of the previous things that I've dealt with, but then also I have to worry about money and constantly being worried about funding life-saving services to sexual assault survivors is definitely a different kind of emotional toll, and it's something that in the past month has surely kept me up at night. But for those of you who don't know, what is STAR? So STAR, as is a very long name, Sexual Trauma Awareness and Response. We are a standalone nonprofit sexual assault center, and we serve 15 parishes in the central and southeast Louisiana. And when I say standalone, what I mean by that is we are not an agency that also serves domestic violence or child. We're not a domestic violence or child advocacy center. Surely there's crossover, but it's really important to understand that distinction because a lot of times people will refer to services for domestic violence survivors. And although it may be survivors who are also sexual assault survivors, when we say sexual assault survivors, sexual trauma survivors, it doesn't necessarily mean they're in an intimate partner relationship. So you may hear around the Capitol from legislators, oh, we fund domestic violence, or we have services for, that's true, but, we really need to understand the differences. And as far as, looking at the landscape of STAR, we're constantly facing cuts to our funding, as most organizations are. Many of our grants that we receive are pass-through grants through the federal government, and they're administered by the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement. VOCA is one of the grants we receive quite a number of dollars from, but that's the one that tends to be most shifting as it relates to funding our services. But STAR provides free advocacy, case management, accompaniment services, free therapy, and legal representation to sexual assault survivors. One of the other things we do, which I'm sure there will eventually be questions on, is providing education, training, and other resources to organizations and communities. Most notable is probably people have heard we had a contract with LSU, which we can get into any of your questions about that later. But, the other thing that I guess talking about the landscape of sexual assault in general and as it relates to the press, one of the things that's really hard for us to sort of get issues addressed when it comes to sexual assault in Louisiana is because it's a very private crime and not every survivor wants to come forward and tell their story. But I will say, unlike I'm sure maybe other speakers who kind of knock the press at times, for us, it's really critical because anytime we've ever been able to accomplish something truly important, especially as it relates to policy changes in the legislature, it is because a survivor was brave enough to tell their story and there was a reporter who was willing to listen and write about it. So that is something that is really critical. And it's hard to do that because a lot of times we may know of issues. There's still plenty of issues, and I'm going to get into quite a number of issues that we're still faced with in Louisiana, but it's hard because we're trying to maintain privacy and confidentiality for survivors, and if they don't want to come forward, it's like I want to go to a reporter and say, oh, here are all these issues, but if you look at where they're coming from, it may inadvertently reveal the identity and information about the survivor when they didn't want us to share anything about that. So that is one of the things that presents a challenge when it comes to sexual assault and addressing issues in our state. But, you know, just highlighting some of the things that you may remember and at this point may have forgotten about that we were able to get sort of addressed. You know, in 2014, there was an article published by a Times-Picayune reporter dealing with billing for sexual assault forensic examinations. That was a process that, you know, had been happening for a while now. We had a federal law that said you cannot charge victims for forensic medical exams. But until that reporter sort of revealed what was going on, we weren't able to get the policy changes needed because, you know, it was having to come up with money. And that was in 2015 when there was constant cuts during the Jindal administration, but we rallied together, and because of the press and highlighting that issue, we were able to get the needed changes we did to support survivors. And then another thing that, you know, was also addressed in 2019 was material witness warrants. I'm not sure if any of you all remember sexual assault survivors were being jailed if they didn't want to participate in certain areas because they just didn't want to participate. And so sometimes they were jailed in the same parish facility as their perpetrators while they were awaiting trial, which was so dangerous. So we were able to get a bill passed that would curb and limit the way that you could, it didn't completely prohibit material witness warrants, but it really narrowed the ability to use them. Some other things that, you know, journalists have been able to uncover and address dealing with sexual assault. Andrea Gallo did a lot of reporting in, I think, 2020 dealing with sexual harassment happening in state agencies. Obviously, a lot of people are always asking us questions about LSU and Title IX, and that certainly was the big story in 2021. And, you know, as we all are probably well aware, it continues to be something that is discussed. Julia Donahue, who's not here, she also did some really great reporting last year on access to forensic medical reports and having survivors to have access to their own information that, you know, we eventually passed a bill to address that. But one of the things, you know, that that are still ongoing, and it's like I would love to see the press look into, are some things that you may not be aware of, and hopefully there could be some pressure and some things to look into this. But, you know, as I mentioned, STAR receives quite a number of grants, pass-through grants from the federal government. As of today, we have yet to be notified of an announcement for what's called STOP funding. STOP funding is a formula grant that has passed from the Office on Violence Against Women to LCLE, and it's given to prosecutors, officers, and service providers. From what has been discussed, it's possibly that we are out of compliance, we meaning Louisiana is out of compliance with the state implementation plan dealing with this funding. And as of now, we're not aware if we're going to get any funding. For STAR, that's critical because it pays for a part-time counselor in our Central Louisiana office where we're constantly faced with a wait list. So right now, I'm missing funding to pay somebody, but we're having to shift around our budget to be able to continue to provide that service. So we have yet to have been told when we will receive notice of the funding, and so I would love for that to be looked into to get to the bottom of what's going on with this funding. Some other things that have happened over the years, but once again, it's hard to get any survivor to necessarily come forward for fear of retaliation, is We have federal and state law that prohibits the giving sexual assault survivors polygraph examinations. You're not allowed to ask them or require them to take a polygraph as a condition of doing an investigation. That's still happening, very much though. So we don't have a survivor who's ready to come forward and tell their story, so I would love for there to be some great reporters looking into that and finding out which jurisdictions have internal policies about this. Some other things that are really important and overall affect sexual assault and how we handle it. In 2019, we passed a bill, Act 401, to curb child marriages. We couldn't get a complete ban on marriages for anyone under the age of 18, but we passed some legislation that would limit the ability to marry somebody with a certain age difference, as well as there would be a required report each year that would say what parishes allowed minors to marry. So, because we did at least have it to where you would be required to get judicial permission in order for a minor to be married. I have requested multiple times through LDH, which it's a report that would be produced from Vital Records. Almost 4 years later, we have yet to see a report. They say they don't have it. So I would love for there to be some noise as to why there is no report. Some other things to look into as we talk about different things, especially when it comes to mandatory reporters and who's reporting, issues of child abuse, child sexual abuse. Every year, teachers are required to take DCFS's mandatory mandated reporter training. That was Act 272 of the 2020 regular session. I suspect that many school districts are not in compliance with this, and this is a free training. This is a free training online that teachers can access, and I still suspect that it's not something that's necessarily in all school districts being complied with. Some other things that are ongoing challenges that we are having, many of us in sort of the victim service provider field really pushed for legislation last year that would allow crime victims, all crime victims, to be able to access the Crime Victims Reparation Fund more easily by not requiring a report to law enforcement. You would still be required to report, but report to a mental health service provider, a doctor, any kind of healthcare provider. We have seen where there are some rules that are being going through the process that just do not actually comply with the law. And one of the things that happened through that process, which I disagree, it just does not actually comply with what the law says. It now is saying that sexual assault survivors can only get reimbursed at a maximum of $1,000 for medical expenses unrelated to their forensic medical exam. That's not what the law said. The law, there was an amendment that was added towards the end to say that forensic medical exam expenses alone, the hospital can get $1,000, the provider could get $600, and then any other expense related to for a sexual assault survivor, there was nothing in there that would limit their ability to get reimbursement for those expenses. But the rules that are being promulgated right now, for whatever reason, have said, oh, this limits any sexual assault survivor's ability to access the fund other than $1,000. That's not what the law says, and it's out of compliance. So we're trying to do things. We're going to submit some public records to try to get some legislative oversight as it relates to that, because that clearly runs afoul to what the law says. Some other things that I haven't seen as much out there about is we passed a law in 2021 originally, and then we revised it slightly to make sure it was clear to some judges what our intention was. But we passed a law that eliminated the prescriptive period for civil lawsuits for child sexual abuse. When we did that, we also allowed for a look-back period of 3 years, meaning even if something had previously prescribed, or, for those of you who may not know legal terminology, the statute of limitations is what that would be referred to. we allow them a new window to be able to file suit against those who abuse them as children. And we know from just research that on average, child sexual abuse survivors typically don't disclose until about 52 years of age. So the previous time period was only about 10 years from the time they became 18. So that puts them basically as having to disclose, having to file a lawsuit at 28 years old. As you can imagine, it's not until much later in life that people tend to realize, the extent of the abuse. But right now, the Catholic Church is challenging the constitutionality of this law, and it's going to the Louisiana Supreme Court right now. There was a survivor who filed suit, and the Catholic Church won at the district court level in New Orleans, and there's a couple of different cases that are happening dealing with that law, but I would love to see more noise about what's happening with that case and more coverage. So it's hard to give anybody specific data or facts on the statistics of sexual assault in Louisiana, because sexual assault in general is just one of the most underreported crimes. But then when people see high numbers, they immediately are like, oh, this is so terrible. We actually want our numbers to be high, because when you have high numbers, it shows faith and trust in the system that something will be done. And on the other hand, it's like we always know that the numbers are never what is actually happening. So those are some things I just kind of wanted to give an overview about. There's definitely some, lots of work that we plan to do and want to do. STAR has primarily focused much of our efforts on intervention and response related legislation. We really want to take more proactive measures in what true prevention would be. And most people may not realize, but prevention doesn't just look like what we actually have is risk reduction. Risk reduction is, self-defense. That doesn't truly prevent sexual assault. What does prevent sexual assault, and what the CDC has posted in their Stop Sexual Violence Technical Package, is that access to paid family leave, access to pay equity, a lot of these other social justice issues that you see happening, that, quality child care access, these are all things that in the grand scheme of things help to prevent sexual assault. And so STAR is going to be taking a more active role in those types of measures, although we haven't in the past. That is our plan for the future. And, I'm happy to answer any questions you all may have right now.
Can you tell me a little bit about any specific legislation coming up in the next session that you guys are really, whether you're not the ones carrying it, but really focused on pushing towards our legislators?
Sure. So the question was if there's any specific legislation that STAR, whether we're carrying directly or supporting, anything coming up that we are focused on. And the answer is, we have been approached and consulted with to support exceptions to the abortion ban for sexual assault. That is something that, in general, for us, our mission is to support survivors. And so for us, that is something that we will be looking into supporting for survivors. On the other hand, too, we support all survivors no matter what their choices are. And there is a law that we currently have that I actually helped get passed in 2016, where if you become pregnant as a result of rape, you can terminate the parental rights of the rapist. I've represented 2 survivors in proceedings like that. There's some challenges to the way it's currently drafted, because it's in the section of law that deals with parental right termination in general, which most of the time when you're terminating the parental rights of someone, it's because of abuse to the child or neglect. And so how we have the current law does not really reflect the dynamics of what happens in those cases, because usually you have a parent that is not abusive to the child, it's just they were abused. And so we want to take that section and kind of isolate it to go through a different process, so the survivor is not being looked at as an abuser, because right now, with the way it's set up, it kind of has a process that's more like, oh, well, the survivor who is the mother, or became pregnant as a result of rape is having to check in with the attorney for the child. And it's just not, the process isn't how we think it should be in that case. So that's another bill that we're looking to do. Yes, sir.
What's the level or extent of support you've gotten from, say, district attorney's offices, particularly those outside the large metro areas? You talk about maybe more in those rural areas where things might fall under the radar a bit more.
Sure. So the question is, what specific support have we had from district attorneys outside the metro area? I guess to answer your question, I need to ask a question. Do you mean financial support? Do you mean support for survivors, or can you? All the above. So financial support has, as it relates to district attorneys, has so far only been through the East Baton Rouge District Attorney's Office. As some may know, STAR started out as a division of the East Baton Rouge District Attorney's Office. We became a nonprofit in 2011, but officially started 2012, and that is who currently still provides financial support to us. As it relates to other district attorneys, definitely we have had a really good working relationship in recent time, and I had a meeting just last week with people from the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office. They too want to collaborate with us, and we still collaborate in other ways. I would say that, it kind of just depends. What ends up happening is whenever there's a sexual assault survivor who may have a case that goes through the criminal legal system, we provide attorneys or have attorneys available for them to be represented in their victim rights. And survivors have a lot of independent victim legal rights that they can seek, have standing to be able to go before and just have, I'm getting stumped here. They can exercise their rights within the criminal legal system. So that at first, sometimes district attorneys are kind of like, wait, who are you? Are you coming in to tell us what to do? But then when they see how helpful it is for survivors to have an independent voice, they tend to be supportive. And I'd say that, we've worked with some assistant attorney generals who have gone through to different parishes in representing. I think we've done some other collaboration with like St. Tammany, Jefferson Parish, Ascension, but we're still trying to get into certain places. And the truth is that you have to have reported cases, you have to have arrests, and then you have to have a case that is actually being prosecuted in order for that to happen. So in the areas where we haven't quite established relationships with, it might just be because that, the shift, the culture for reporting, charging, and prosecuting is not quite there yet. Yes, sir?
Are there any non-law enforcement, non-judicial players in this chain that victims can go to and talk with if they're unsure, who can advise them how to go further?
Sure. So the question was, is there any non-law enforcement, non-judicial officers or players that victims can go to be advised on about options and how to go through the process? Yes, absolutely. STAR. That is what we're here for. All of our services are free, and that's exactly what we do. We have survivors, they come in, they're assigned an advocate who can, if they do decide to go through any reporting process, can accompany them to an interview with law enforcement, prosecutors. Also, depending on what's going on, we could pair them up with one of our attorneys who can file certain types of civil legal forms of remedy, as well as if ultimately they do engage with the criminal legal system, our attorneys can represent them to exercise their victim rights within the criminal process. So definitely STAR is one of the places, and we only serve 15 parishes within Louisiana. La Fossa is the state coalition, and they have a list of all the other centers, and most of those centers are also dual dual child advocacy, sexual assault, or domestic violence sexual assault agencies. So sometimes the unfortunate truth is their services for sexual assault may get hidden in how they portray their services because of DV is certainly one of the things where more funding tends to be available. But if you go to LaFosa's website, they have a list of all the centers that are supposed to be providing services to sexual assault survivors.
Have you heard of any sexual assault survivors, or are you aware of any who may have struggled to get abortion care, other reproductive health care they need after the state's abortion ban took effect last year?
The question was, am I aware of any sexual assault survivors who have not been able to get any kind of abortion care, health care, or anything related since the Dobbs decision? I'm not personally aware, but that's also really hard to kind of assess, because I think just with the climate, if somebody becomes pregnant as a result of rape and then they don't have access to abortion services, maybe they're going out of, time is of the essence and they're trying to get funding. A lot of times we typically see sexual assault survivors, a little bit after their immediate crisis is happening. But I will say one of the things that we passed last year, and it was not in any way related to us anticipating Dobbs or anything like that, but we passed a bill that mandated when survivors go to the hospital to receive forensic medical exams, that all the hospitals must provide emergency contraception to those who want it. It does require a negative pregnancy test. The reason that's not really a big deal is because that was part of the standard of care anyway, and it doesn't, emergency contraception does not work to end a pregnancy, but you certainly, it's just not something you would take if you are in fact already pregnant. So we're hoping that that helps, but as you know, not everyone reports, not everyone goes to the hospital right after a sexual assault. In fact, the 2 survivors that I have represented who became pregnant as a result of rape did not really know they were raped because of, they woke up and maybe thought something happened, but due to alcohol and intoxication, they weren't quite sure. So they didn't report to the hospital right away. So the unfortunate reality is not everyone's going to know they were possibly assaulted to get that immediate access to emergency contraception.
And you're on the task force for Regina Barrow's bill that did not pass last year that would allow surgical castration for those who commit sexual crimes against children. And you were not for it last year. You are helping advise her on this task force. Can you kind of give some of the other options that you've been telling her as ways to prevent these crimes from happening?
Yes, so the question was, last year Senator Regina Barrow had proposed a bill to allow for surgical castration of offenders for crimes against children, and I was opposed to that, and I said so at the time, and out of that legislation came a study, a task force to get into how we can truly prevent crimes against children. So I was against that, first of all, because it's not been shown to be effective. There are some people who are certainly in the criminal justice reform field who said, what happens if, once you do a surgical castration, you certainly can't reverse that, but then also the constitutionality of that. But, what we know about offenders is it's not that isn't necessarily going to prevent anything. I mean, once again, the things that we truly believe prevent sexual abuse is protective factors put in place, teaching kids about their bodies, teaching kids about consent, good touch, bad touch. It seems very simple, but trying to get legislation passed that would allow those concepts to be taught over the years, is fairly difficult. But when you teach those things to children, they are able to readily identify red flags, potential grooming process, So that's that one piece. And then there's some other factors that we're going to have somebody come to the next task force meeting who will really get in. She has worked with offenders and victims, but she can speak more to the dynamics of what truly works to prevent recidivism in sex offenders.
Morgan, what is your impression of the report last week that more than 300 sexual abuse cases at LSU over the last year, more than 95% of them have been dismissed?
Yeah. So the question was, what is my impression of the report that over 300 cases from LSU that were reported were dismissed without discipline? I actually tweeted about this. Twitter is the place to get out a message very quickly, because that report is a little bit misleading. That report is any report to the Title IX office. So it could be somebody who made a report because they heard somebody who heard somebody. And so it may not be a report that has a lot of information in it. It may also be a report that a survivor may have disclosed to somebody, not knowing that professor or individual had to report that to Title IX, and they did not want to go through a process. And so, once again, STAR supports survivors, so we want them to feel comfortable, safe through that process. So although that particular thing was a little bit misleading, what I would be more interested in knowing is how many cases were reported to LSU where survivors wanted to engage in the process and go through the process. How many of those cases did or did not result in discipline? I will tell you, from what I understand from our legal program, who has represented survivors, I've also represented survivors through the Title IX process. Of the ones that we have done, there has been discipline. And that is something, it's not, I guess, as something everyone, I guess, realizes, but it is something that is to be commended for LSU. So there's still a lot to do. There's still some trauma-informed interviewing that needs to occur. Like most places, I think they still have a lot of turnover with their investigators and that kind of thing. But of the cases that I'm aware of, at least at STAR, and that's not all of them, there has been discipline. So once again, I think that report was slightly misleading, but we still need to get to the bottom of what the true reports that were a survivor engaged in the process, how many of those didn't result in discipline? That's what I want to know.
What about the Madison Brooks case? LSU, at times it appears, is focused more on underage drinking rather than a sexual assault, which the attorneys for the alleged perpetrators deny occurred. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so the question was about Madison Brooks and my thoughts on the messaging around alcohol. I definitely put out a statement about that and did an op-ed regarding that. Just very clearly, alcohol is not the cause of rape. Perpetrators are the cause of rape. And if anybody had picked her up that wasn't a rapist and brought her somewhere safe, I truly believe that the chain of events would not have happened as they did. Now, is there a part to play as far as civil responsibility for Reggies and serving underage, individuals? Yes, that's definitely, they have some responsibility here. But as far as it relates to the rape, the alcohol didn't cause the rape. And in fact, that same scenario happens over and over again in Tigerland, irrespective of if somebody was served underage. Where most people are finally seeing this is because she died, and that's why it's being highlighted. But that's sort of a normal weekend where STAR, our advocates, are on call 24/7, and they go to the hospital to accompany survivors during forensic exams. That's something we see fairly often. And in fact, there's been prior prosecutions that have happened similar. Now, this is obviously a little different in that she did not survive. She tragically died. But it's that everything else. And then there's this, I did hear where the attorneys were saying, well, they were, drunk, or they didn't know what they were doing. And I find it ironic that people who claim in that situation for perpetrators, they didn't know what they were doing. But it's not, it's about the dynamics of somebody's body. And magically enough, and this is blunt to say, but you don't ever see where people who are accused of rape, they didn't accidentally, shove their penises inside of a pencil sharpener or something with sharp objects. I mean, that's, it's always very specific so I don't buy into they were too drunk piece.
Speaking of continuing with the Madison Brooks story, what do you have to say about people who are saying she's not alive to say that she was a victim? She's not here today to say that she was not raped, or if she was raped. What do you have to say to that?
So the question was, what do I have to say to people who say she was not alive to say if she was or was not a victim? What I say is, I know from working with sexual assault survivors that it is incredibly, and it's so challenging to be able to come forward, report, and go through a process where there is an investigation that results in charges. So when people say, she's not here to report that, there must, in my mind, have been pretty significant evidence for that to happen, for that investigation to result in the way it did, when my experience is that survivors that want to report, survivors that are coming before law enforcement and saying they are a victim, their cases do not always end up being prosecuted. And it's just a fact that, just because something cannot be proven doesn't mean it didn't happen. Our justice system, you have to meet certain burdens of proof in order for there to be an arrest and then ultimately a conviction. And that's just a reality. So, and then, just because if they were later to be found not guilty, that doesn't make them innocent. So to the people who say, well, she couldn't say, there must have been something pretty significant for there to be a decision to charge individuals when there was no reporting by the survivor. Or in that case, she actually is a victim.
Building on that a little bit, you mentioned earlier, kind of the challenges of getting an arrest and the higher threshold still getting a prosecution. Do you see the Madison Brooks case as an outlier from that? And if so, is it in any way like a model for how prosecutors should handle other cases?
So the question was going back to reporting and higher thresholds for prosecutors to get convictions. Is the Madison Brooks case an outlier, or should it be looked at as a model? I think that it depends, and that's a very lawyer answer to say, for it depends. I think that for me as somebody who's an advocate for survivors, if a survivor does not want to be forced through a process, I truly believe we need to listen to survivors and respect their wishes, because not everyone wants to go through that process. I mean, for me, just looking at the social media comments and all the people who are saying she's a liar when she didn't in fact report is telling to why people don't want to go through this system. But as it relates to there being what truly looks like a deep dive into finding facts, finding enough evidence to make an arrest, I think that is a model, and we should commend law enforcement for doing their due diligence to get whatever they needed to make that connection and to find enough probable cause to arrest those individuals. That is the model. But once again, this is a little different. It's not forcing a victim to go through a process they don't want because she hasn't actually revealed, anything about her wishes, unfortunately. But I do think that, the collaboration, really digging into the facts is necessary, because all too often, going back to the jurisdictions where maybe they're still doing polygraphs and they're not supposed to, we will see survivors make a report to law enforcement, and without any investigation by contacting witnesses, by contacting those that the individual accuses, there will be a determination that this victim's lying and we're not going to do anything about it. Oh, but will you take a polygraph so we can really see if you're telling the truth about this? And that's before they even do any due diligence. So for me, if we have more faith and go through the entire process and start by believing, it's not to say you're starting by saying that the other parties are guilty. You're starting by taking the information that's given to you and doing a thorough investigation before coming to any conclusions. And once again, just because you may come to the conclusion you don't have enough evidence to apply for a warrant to get an arrest, that does not mean the victim is lying. It just is a fact that sexual assault happens behind closed doors. It's one of the realities of this type of crime.
Do you believe that the defense lawyers libeled Madison Brooks in their noontime press conference, in which one of them said that if she were here today, she'd be fine with all of this?
So the question was, do I believe that the attorneys for the defense committed libel or defamation against Madison Brooks by saying she would have been okay with all of this in the press conference? So I have to answer as a lawyer once again and say, to prove that type of statement, you have to pretty much know like it's false. And if Scott Sternberg is watching, he's gonna be like, you're butchering whatever the legal process is. He's actually, as we speak, for those of you who know him, he's actually doing a pro bono case for a sexual assault survivor who was sued for defamation. But it's in that situation, we don't know, right? We don't know what she would or would not have done. So I don't know that he could actually be held responsible for any kind of defamation. Do I think that was tacky and inappropriate? Absolutely.
How closely will you follow the Sharon Lewis case if it goes to trial?
The question was, how closely will we follow the Sharon Lewis case if it goes to trial? I think for us, we're always willing to support sexual assault survivors no matter what. Depending on, I guess, if somebody requests that we, follow. I mean, we definitely have limited staff capacity, but if there's, a way for us to lend our support to her as a survivor, we certainly would if asked.
I think it's 1 o'clock.
Thank you. How it did not fall, I will never know.
Can I ask you some questions?